Hello, online ag economics students. We're looking this week at the last half of chapter 9, and we're going to continue our discussion regarding market equilibrium and product price in imperfect competition scenarios. A little bit of review. We're going to do a little bit of comparison between perfect competition and imperfect competition when it comes to producer surplus, consumer surplus, and dead weight loss. So if you recall, in perfect competition, we have our supply curve and our demand curve, and we produce at the point where supply equals demand, and the producer surplus in this situation is the area that is below the product price and above the supply curve. Okay, so that is the producer surplus. The consumer surplus, if you recall, is the area that is below the demand curve and above the product price. So this is the consumer surplus in perfect competition. In this case, all area captured above and below the supply curve, all is captured by either the consumer or the producer. So in this case, there is no dead weight loss to society because in perfect competition, we maximize the welfare effects to society. Okay. The producer surplus and consumer surplus for imperfect competition is looked at a little bit differently though, because if you remember in imperfect competition, which is the monopoly, the oligopoly, the monopsony scenarios that we talked about last week, the producers are going to produce at a quantity where the supply curve meets the marginal revenue curve, and they're going to charge at a price where that quantity hits the demand curve. Okay, so our price here is higher than the perfect competition price, right? So it's all the way up here. So this leaves our producer surplus to be the area, again, below the price, above the supply curve, but we cannot capture this little triangle because we're not producing at those increasing quantities. So we can only capture the area that is within the quantities that we are producing. So for the producer surplus, we now have this quadrilateral shape that covers 5, 4, 6, 3, and 7. Okay, and then our consumer surplus is the area that's above the price and below the demand curve. And also we need to make sure that it's to the left, that it only includes quantities that are being produced, which that is the case. We're to the left of this line here. Okay, so we have a few questions to ask ourselves. Okay, we've identified producer surplus, consumer surplus. Now we need to identify the dead weight loss. In this scenario, this 1 and 2 are not captured by the market. So they're not, this is kind of money that is not captured by either the producers or the consumers. So that's a dead weight loss to society. That's what the areas 1 and 2 are considered, dead weight loss. Okay. So we need to look at, in imperfect competition, are consumers better off or worse off? Basically, is the area of their triangle larger or smaller in imperfect competition compared to perfect competition? Well, consumers was this yellow area here. Their triangle actually decreased. It got smaller because if you remember their original triangle was this green area, and it shrunk to this small yellow area. So they are worse off because they are not capturing as much money as they were in perfect competition. Are producers better off or worse off? Well, we need to compare the area that they are receiving in imperfect competition to the area that they did receive in perfect competition. So in perfect competition, they were this lower green triangle here that I'm shading in right now. Maybe I shouldn't use green or red. I've used every color. We'll do purple. Okay, so in perfect competition, that first graph that I showed you, producers were this triangle. In imperfect competition, which I just showed you, they were this blue quadrilateral. Okay, so this second area is larger than the first area. We did give up this little section of this number 2 over here, but we gained a larger rectangle. Okay, so we kind of swapped those two things. So producers are better off in imperfect competition. Okay, which makes sense because we're talking about fewer producers in an oligopoly and we're talking about one producer in a monopoly, and we saw last week that they can charge more money in those situations, so they are better off. Okay, is the total economy better or worse off? Well, to figure out the total economy, we need to take the area of both the producers and the consumers. So I'm going to clear this out for a second. This might help us. Okay, so for the imperfect competition, the total area that either producers or consumers covered was this green area here. So this was imperfect. And the total area that was covered in perfect competition was this triangle. So we had 1 and 2, which is additional, which is more than imperfect competition. So the whole economy is better off. Everything is captured that can possibly be captured financially by either producers or consumers in perfect competition. So in perfect competition, we cover more area, so we're better off there. Okay. This slide just sort of summarizes some of that for you, comparing what the perfect competition producer and consumer surplus looks like, and then imperfect competition producer, consumer, and dead weight loss. As you can see, there's no dead weight loss in perfect competition. In the first half of this chapter, we talked about imperfect competition as it relates to selling. This chapter this second half of this chapter, we're going to focus on imperfect competition as it relates to buying. So remember, we talked about monopolistic producers, oligopolies, and monopolies. Monopolistic, there was many sellers, but they were all differentiated. Oligopoly, there was a few sellers. Monopoly, there was one seller. On the flip side of that, buyers can influence price as well. So, and there can be few numbers of buyers that create this imperfect competition as well. So there are 3 types of imperfect competition looking at the buying side, and the names are so similar to the imperfect competition names that it's hard to keep these straight, okay? But so we have monopsonistic, which is kind of the reverse of monopolistic, which we have many buyers, but they're each differentiated. We'll talk a little bit more about each of these soon. Then we have oligopsony or oligopsonistic, where there are few large buyers in the market. And then we have monopsony or monopsonistic or monopsonist, which there's only one buyer. Okay. So the first example, where there's many buyers, but they all differentiate themselves, they may differentiate themselves by the location of their facilities, maybe their willingness to provide credit, their willingness to provide technical assistance, maybe the personal characteristics of the buyer. So if you're a producer and you're producing all these products and you want to sell it somewhere, but you're trying to figure out where are you going to sell this to, well, first you might say, I'm going to sell it to the firm that is going to give me the highest price. But if all the prices are pretty similar, then maybe you're going to look at some of these other aspects to figure out who you're going to sell your product to. Okay. There's not very many really good examples of this situation of monopsonistic buyers in agriculture, because generally farmers and producers, they don't have a lot of choices of where they're going to sell their product to. So usually we see examples of the other two types of imperfect competition. The second type of imperfect competitively buyers is oligopsony. So this is where there's few buyers in the market and farmers have a choice of a few select places that they can sell their product to. We see this with grain farmers and dairy farmers and beef farmers. So grain farmers can sell their corn and soybeans. There are a few different places in the region that they can sell their corn to. Pearl City Elevator, Eastland Feed and Grain, and there are several more. Okay, they will probably look around first at price, and then they might look at, okay, what are the wait times to unload my grain here? How nice are these buyers? How nice are these people? And some of those other distinguishing features that we talked about before. Dairy farmers, depending how large they are, might also have a few options of where they can sell their milk, who will come and pick up their milk, you know, and the buyers can differentiate themselves by how many, you know, maybe they'll say, we'll pick up your milk every day, every other day, and there might be other things associated with that. Some dairy farmers, if they're really small, they're actually lucky to get a single buyer. But some of the larger farmers have choices of who they could have buy their milk. And then beef farmers also have a few options of where they can sell their cattle for processing. We do have Lena Made Meats, we have Eichmann's, we have Equity, which is in Monroe, and I'm sure, and there's more in the region, but you know, there's not a ton. There's just a few buyers in the market in these examples. Monopsony is where there's just one buyer, okay? So the best example probably for our area is this second example here. So hemp processing facilities. Since hemp production is pretty new, there's not very many processing facilities locally that producers can sell their hemp to. And I know there's a couple being built, and then we might have some choices, but really there's not a lot of places that can be sold, so you may be left with one option. Maybe in other regions that are more rural, maybe there's only one meat processing facility that beef farmers can sell their product to. Again, this isn't super common. The most common examples in agriculture are those oligopsony examples on the previous slide, but the definition of this is basically that a large number of farmers face a single buyer for their product. So they have to sell their product to that buyer because that's their only option. So with that, we get sort of an interesting input cost curve and an interesting supply of input curve for monopsony buyers. So because monopsonists are the only buyer in the market, the more product that they buy, that raises the entire market demand because they're the only buyer. They're the only buyer demanding that product. So when they demand more product, the price of that product is actually going to increase because, again, they are the only buyer making up the buyer's market. So if they demand less of that product, the product price will decrease. So normally in perfect competition, the market price is the market price, and it doesn't matter. One individual buyer doesn't have that much influence over the price of the product, but because a monopsony buyer is the only buyer, they have their actions completely control the price of the input. So if we only had one buyer buying beef cattle and they all of a sudden decided they want, to go from buying 50,000 head of beef cattle to 100,000 head of beef cattle, the price that they're going to have to pay for those additional beef cattle is going to increase. And the price for each additional one, that's what marginal input cost is going to increase as well. This slide sort of summarizes that concept in a different way. So you can read that to see if you catch some things with this slide. So a monopsonist buyer, the only buyer in the market, will continue to make money as long as its marginal revenue of product is greater than its marginal input cost. So that basically means that the amount of additional money that it is bringing in by selling one more unit of product is greater than the amount of additional money that it costs to produce that one more unit of product. Okay, so as soon as cost of an additional product is greater than revenue received by that product, the monopsonist is no longer making any more profit. In fact, they're going to be losing money if the cost is greater than the revenue. So at this point on the graph, so we have quantity increasing as we go to the right here, and here quantity is 0, right? So at, let's just say 1, at quantity of 1, so if they produce 1, we have the marginal input cost curve here, and we have the marginal revenue product curve here. So marginal input cost is how much it's costing them to produce one more unit of product, and marginal revenue product is how much money they're bringing in from that product. So at 1, it's costing them, let's just say this is $4. But they are able to charge, let's say $20 for that product. So are they making money? Yes. So they're going to keep on chugging along to the right and produce more. So let's say they get over here to 5. So now they're going to produce 5. Well, at 5 is going to cost them approximately $8 or $9 to produce 5. And they're going to be able to bring in a revenue per unit of about 17. So yep, they're going to keep producing. So they continue to do this until marginal revenue equals marginal cost, which is at this point right here. So this would be the quantity they would produce at, and this would be the price per unit that it would cost them. Anything further to the right of the graph, the revenue is going to be less than the cost, okay? Because the revenue, like at this point, is at about 10, and the cost at that point is, 17. So that production doesn't make sense anymore. If we wanted to calculate the marginal input cost, which you do have a problem in this week's homework where you're going to have to do that, remember the equation is basically change in cost divided by change in units produced. So first thing, let's figure out what this chart is telling us. So this is the units of input. So basically they're 1 unit, 2 unit, 3 unit, 4 unit. That's how many additional items they're purchasing in order to produce their product. And this is the price per unit, the average price per unit. So the first unit is going to cost them $3. The second, we've brought up our average to $3.50. Third one, $4. Fourth one, $4.50, etc. So as demand for this input increases, the price is increasing again because they're the only buyer in the market. So how this affects total cost, we're just multiplying the input times the price to get to the total cost. So 1 times 3 is 3, 2 times $3.50 equals 7, 3 times $4 equals 12, and so on. So they've calculated that out for you. So marginal input cost, change in cost divided by change in units produced. So from 3 to 7, our change in cost is 4, right? 7 minus 3 is 4. And divided by the change in units, well, we went from 1 to 2. So we've only changed by 1 unit. So our marginal input cost there is $4. From 7 to 12, our change in cost is 5, right? Because 7 or 12 minus 7 is 5. And the number of units that we've changed, we've gone from 2 to 3, so that's only a change in 1. So our marginal cost is $5. And then from 18 to 12, that's 6. Again, we're only changing 1. So it costs us from 1 unit to 2 unit, it costs us $4 additional to buy one more. From 2 units to 3 units, it costs us $5. So you can see again, our marginal cost is increasing. So go ahead and calculate the rest of those marginal input costs out. And yeah, you're going to see an increase because the more that this monopsony demands, the more that's demanded, the higher the price is going to go. Because again, they're the only buyer in the market. Okay, so we're back to this similar graph to figure out. We know that where marginal input cost equals marginal revenue cost, so marginal input cost equals marginal revenue cost, point A, that's the quantity at which is the profit maximizing quantity for a monopsony. Now, will they be buying the input at this price as well? No, they will not. They will actually buy the input for less. Okay, we're talking about buyers here. So they want to buy the input for less. They're going to follow that A point down to where we meet the supply curve and then follow that over to the price, because at market supply and demand, the producers are willing to accept a lesser amount. And this is the price that the producers are willing to sell their product to the buyers for. So if the producers are willing to sell it for, let's say this is $5 and this is $15, if the producers are willing to sell it for $5, why would the buyers say, no, I'm going to give you $15 for that? No, they're going to buy it at what the producers are willing to sell it for at that cheaper price. Okay, so this is the difference between what the monopsonists would be willing to pay. So they would be willing to pay 15, but what they actually pay is called monopsonistic exploitation. So what they would pay under perfect competition and what they actually pay under monopsony is going to be less, in this case 10. So the value of monopsonistic exploitation in this case is 10. So they're basically being able to take advantage of the buyers just by this imperfect market situation, or take advantage of the producers because of this imperfect buying situation. So for an oligopsonist, finding the equilibrium, the profit maximizing quantity, and the price that they're going to actually pay for the product as buyers, that's the same exact procedure as for the monopsony, which we just reviewed. This is an interesting diagram that allows us to follow basically a baby beef calf from the farm all the way to the grocery store here at the end. Different businesses and producers and consumers have different amount of influence on the price of this product as it goes through. So we can see here in the beginning, so we have feeder livestock market. So those are your baby calves, and these come from livestock producers, that have the mother cows who have the calves, and there's a lot of these. Okay, so we would call these they exist in kind of in a nearly perfect market because there's so many of them basically producing the same product, all baby calves. Okay, so they are price takers because the more amount of sellers in the market that you have, the less influence on price that an individual supplier is going to have. Okay, so then they sell it to commercial feed operators who basically feed out these calves until they're X number of pounds before they go to a processing plant. So there are less commercial feeders than there are livestock producers. So the livestock producers have just a few options of who to sell they're beef cows too. So because they have only a few options, the buyers, are one of a few. They're those oligopsonists that we talked about today, and they have a little bit of influence on the price. Okay, so now these cows have been fed out and they weigh a lot and they're ready to be slaughtered and processed by packers. Okay, so I know I just said before that there's not a lot of commercial feeders, but compared to packers, there's a lot less feeders than there are packers. So the packers are now the oligopsonists, and there's just a few of them to whom commercial feeders can sell their product to. Okay, so this would be, Tyson's locally, this would be Eichmann's and Leda Made Meats, but you're not going to take hundreds of cows to Eichmann's or Leda Made Meats. These big commercial feeders places, if they have hundreds and hundreds of cows, they have to take it to really large processing packers, and there's only a few of those. So because there's only a few of those packers are price setters. Okay. So now these packers, there's few of them, and they have a supply of beef. So they have hamburgers, they have steaks, they have ribeyes, they have T-bones. They've got all these meats that they're ready to sell to grocery stores or restaurants. So there are a few of these packers, and there are a few grocery stores and restaurants that they can sell to. So because there are a few packers, that they are low in number, so they can have a higher influence over price of what they want to sell their product to the grocery stores and restaurants too. Okay, so now we're at the grocery stores and the restaurants, and they're selling it to consumers. Well, guess what? There are lots and lots and lots and lots of consumers, but there's only a select number of grocery stores and restaurants. So who's going to set the price in this scenario? The retail chain stores are going to, because there's less of them than there are consumers. So in any situation, the firm or the people who have the most influence over price are the ones that are limited and have fewer either buyers or sellers compared to who they are buying it from or selling it to. Okay, so with this, there becomes issues and problems when there are few buyers in the market, because they become the price setters, and really producers and farmers could go out of business if they only have one or two options to sell their product to, and the producers are not going to give them very much money. So the government has had to step in and put forth some laws and regulations in order to protect producers and make sure that they're making a profit, and make sure that our food supply is safe, and just to make sure they're not being taken advantage of by a limited number of buyers. So there are lots of legislative acts. I'm probably not going to go through each of these. Your textbook describes them more in depth. So go ahead and I'm going to highlight a couple of them, but do read through that section in your textbook. I will highlight here the Caper-Volstead Act. So generally, we talked about last week that collusion and price fixing and teaming up with other people to try to set prices is illegal, but farmers are actually allowed to have bargaining associations, which are also known as cooperatives, to basically bargain for lower input prices and to be able to sell their products for higher sale prices. So they kind of have a special advantage that they can talk to each other and work as a group, almost as a union, to help improve their profit. Okay, so your textbook does go into a little bit more detail about the Caper-Volstead Act, and I encourage you to read through that. There's more information about these cooperatives and bargaining associations in this link that you can check out as well, but Again, it's just kind of an exemption from law that farmers get. More legislative acts. Again, the one that I want to highlight here is the Agricultural Marketing Agreement Act. So this established marketing orders. And marketing orders are put out through the United States Department of Agriculture that basically tells processors that, or it's an agreement basically between processors and producers, that processors will not purchase below a certain price, so that farmers are assured that they will receive at least a minimum of X amount of dollars for their product. So in this case, this is an example from March 2019. But for this particular type of and class of milk and all of these things, the price was set at $17.78 per 100 pounds of milk, that processors cannot buy it from farmers for less than that. So again, it helps. It's this agreement between processors and farmers that's put in place by the government to make sure farmers will continue to have a profit, and it helps to secure the U.S. food supply. Other governmental regulations sometimes, especially on monopolist situations, the government can put a price ceiling on how much that monopolist can charge for their product. So this brings up some information that we learned before, but a monopolist will charge where marginal cost equals marginal revenue, or they will produce, I'm sorry, not charge, at that quantity, and then they will charge where the demand curve meets that quantity. So they would charge this price. If a government comes and puts a price ceiling on this product, they're going to say, actually, you can only charge this price. So basically, the profit is reduced by the value of this triangle. Now, here's their average total cost. So they're still making this amount of profit, but they did lose that upper rectangle of profit. So that's what a price ceiling does. It's not going to change the amount of quantity that is produced by the monopolist. It's just going to reduce their profit. A lump sum tax is a one-time charge that the government may impose on a specific product or firm or monopoly. And then again, all this is going to do, it's not going to increase or decrease the quantity or the price that is being produced. It's just going to decrease the profit. So what we see here, basically, the monopolist is going to charge where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue, or they're going to produce, sorry, not charge. They're going to produce at that quantity, and then they're going to charge, they're going to follow it up to the demand curve, and they're going to charge at this price. So it's not changing the quantity and the price, but what it is changing is the average total cost. So the average total cost was here at A, but now they taxed it, so that is an increased input cost. So now the marginal or the average total cost is here at E. So previously, they would have sold it for, their revenue would have been this rectangle, which it still is, but they would have only had to subtract off this little rectangle, but now they have to subtract off the big rectangle, and their profit is going to be decreased. Okay. Minimum price is something that is set by the government that's basically related to marketing orders, which we kind of explained. That basically says for an input, monopolist has to pay a certain amount of money for an input. Okay, so how that would look, they're going to produce at the point, but this is just from the buying standpoint. So where marginal revenue product equals marginal input, that's the point where they're going to produce, and they are going to buy the input. If they were following the supply curve, they would buy the input here at MF, but the government has said, no, you actually have to buy it for a little bit more money at PF. Okay, so you don't get to basically exploit as much as you would have before. So if you remember, the value of that exploitation, the value of the monopolist exploitation was what they would charge under perfect competition minus what they would what they end up charging as a result of this imperfect competition. But that price is raised a little bit, so that reduces the monopolistic exploitation. Okay, so as we can see, in the selling market, which this was the first half of the chapter, the fewer number of sellers as we go across the board, the more influence on the market and price they will have. That's kind of what this is showing us. So down here, this is saying imperfect competitively markers. They're perfectly competitive markets. There's lots of competitors, and each individual competitor doesn't really have very much market influence. For oligopolies and monopolies, there's less competitors, and they have more influence on price of the product. Okay. And then on the flip side of that, the buying market, the fewer number of buyers, the more control over price and quantity and market in general they're going to have, and the more number of buyers, the less control they're going to have over the market. So those are just two good pictures that kind of just help summarize some of those concepts. So here's a couple summary points that I'll let you kind of read over on your own as well. Reach out if you have any questions over the note sheets or the quiz or the problems for this week. All right, good luck.